Firstly, as what the Minister has just said, that our global trade systems being under stress, indeed, the way things are developing, the world may indeed be trading less with each other or investing less with each other as well. And both are important. Trade investments are always a key driver for Singapore economy. So I want to ask the Minister, should we be concerned that more economies around the world are becoming more nationalistic? Government increasingly looking at balance of trade, balance of current account balances as a pure zero-sum game. How can tiny Singapore respond to this rising economic nationalism? Secondly, beyond exporting goods and services to the consumers of the world, what are the other ways we can sustain growth within our economy? And how can we create opportunities for Singapore? Can Singapore break up from this traditional C plus I plus G plus X kind of model of growth?
Mr. Speaker, sir, indeed, Mr. Liang Eng Hua has raised a very serious concern for all of us, not just Singapore, but for all countries that are participating in the global trading system. As countries become more nationalistic and undertake more unilateralist or protectionist measures, it is a concern to all. The concern will be that there will not just be a shift in the supply chains or the distribution networks or the production sites. The greater concern will be a general downward fall in the investors' and consumer confidence. For Singapore to respond to this scenario, we must make sure that our companies have real capabilities that can allow them to interoperate across a more fragmented landscape. This is not easy, but this is something that we must do in the face of a potential fragmentation of the global economy. On your second question, as any economic students will know, the GDP equation of C plus I plus G plus X minus M, that is for GDP, gross domestic product. How must Singapore grow our economy going forward? What you are alluding to, if I read you correctly, is that we must not just look at what is happening domestically in Singapore. And indeed, that is true. There are three things that we should be focused on. First, what happens domestically? How do we help our companies and workers build real capabilities in order to contest in the new world environment? That is domestic. How do we help them access markets? How do we make sure that the rules allow our companies to overcome both the tariff and the non-tariff barriers? So that's the first part of how we need to run our economy. The second part of how we need to run our economy goes beyond the GDP equation that we just mentioned. And we talk about the GNP, the gross national product. How do we have a sizable base of companies that operate beyond Singapore, but contributing back to the Singapore's economy? And I will use the example of PSA. In PSA, once upon a time, we believed that the port is critical to Singapore, and we continue to believe so. But a port has two possible functions. One is to promote trade with a particular country. The other, most ports are like that. They serve the local domestic economy. But there's a second way of looking at the port, which is the way the Singapore port has developed. We are an exchange platform. So people don't just trade with Singapore, people trade through Singapore. So the vast majority of the containers that comes to Singapore comes through Singapore, and we are a major exchange hub. But having done that is still not sufficient because trade routes might change. And the global supply chains and production patterns will also change, which is why that over the years, PSA have built up a string of ports all around the world, allowing them not just to be a port operator, but allowing them to be a global logistic players. So even if the goods do not come to Singapore or come through Singapore, they will trade on the PSA platforms or on the Singapore platform. This is a new way of looking at how we should do business. And that is why Enterprise Singapore ESG, together with the rest of our economic agencies, are spending so much effort to help our companies to use the world as our hinterland and never be constrained by our geographical size or geographical location. And that will be the next leg of our economic development. And that will be one way where we break the conventional paradigm of the GDP equation, which Mr. Liang mentioned about C plus I plus G plus X minus M. The third prong, which we must always bear in mind and sometimes not so obvious in the public consciousness in our economic strategy, will be how we manage our reserves and where we put our investment. Today, we are in a fortunate position whereby for every $5 we spend in the budget, more than $1, slightly more than $1 this year, comes from our returns from our investment. This has given Singapore economy a significant boost and helped our budgetary constraints very much. And this, we must continue to harness our reserves judiciously to make sure that we create the biggest impact, positive impact for Singaporeans. So going forward, our economic strategy is not just about looking at what we can do domestically between local firms and foreign firms operating here. We must also look at how we grow the external wing, our GNP, and how we master our investment resources to make sure that we have the ammunition for us to weather the storm.